Good afternoon. I like that. It is so wonderful to see you all here today. My name is Jasmine Gonzalez Rose, and I'm a professor of law here and also Associate Dean for Equity, Justice, and Engagement. Love that you're enthusiastic about that. I am equally enthusiastic to be here. So, on behalf of our Dean, Onwachi Willig, on behalf of the faculty, and delighted to see so many of our amazing students in the room today, I'm delighted to absolutely welcome you to this installment of the Barbara Jordan Speaker Series on Race, Law, and Inequality. As Dean Onwachi Willig has shared with us at prior Barbara Jordan Speaker Series lectures, it was after the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police and the racial reckoning that followed in our country that the faculty and the administration began to reflect even more diligently on racism, both in its individualized and its structural forms, and its impact on our institution, and its impact on people. And we really sought to engage in dialogue and to do that more regularly. So that although it has always been important at BU Law to think about the relationship between race, racism, and the law, and to think about how the law has been used as a tool to facilitate racism as well as a tool to mitigate racism. Dina Nwachi Willig heard a renewed call to really engage in this methodical way. And so hence one of the outcomes of these conversations was the establishment of this Barbara Jordan Speaker Series in honor of the extremely distinguished alumna from class of 1959, who was the first African American woman elected to Congress from the Deep South. This series is now endowed thanks to a generous gift from Gary Tischler, an esteemed graduate of class of 1987. We are deeply grateful for his generous support to the law school and stepping up to support this speaker series. I want to thank Elizabeth Clancy, Assistant Director of Events and Conferences, who has put so much energy into organizing this event, and everyone else who worked on it. I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker, who is one of the newest faculty members here, but not a new faculty member, a very experienced faculty member and expert in tax. Professor Stephen Dean may be newly joined the permanent faculty, but was here all last year as a visitor. And we're so happy that you've joined us full-time and going forward. Professor Dean has published books about taxation, philanthropy, social enterprise. He's created and hosted 2 seasons of the Tax Maven, which was a podcast featuring influential tax law experts discussing their scholarship and answering questions about tax. He has served as the faculty director of the NYU Law School's graduate tax program and practiced tax law. He is a graduate of Yale Law School and Williams College. His book, Global Jim Crow, Taxation and Racial Capitalism, forthcoming with Oxford University Press, asks important questions. And these questions include, what makes some nations rich and some nations poor? What do even the most powerful states struggle to tax why do they struggle to tax giant multinationals? And he tells us that the answers to these questions are, can be found in what he calls global Jim Crow, and we'll be telling us about. And that this was created as a response to fears over the rise of sovereign African states in the 1950s and 60s. And he tells us that after half a century, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has shielded multinationals from taxation, depriving even the wealthiest states of tax revenues. And he explores institutional racism within the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development body. So I am thrilled to give the floor to Professor Stephen Dean for his lecture on global Jim Crow taxation and racial capitalism. And I invite those who are joining us hybrid to put any questions they may have in the Q&A function. And let's just begin by giving a warm welcome to Stephen Dean.
Thank you, Associate Dean Gonzalez-Rose. I really appreciate your words of welcome, Dean Wilig, for having me here and for creating this wonderful speaker series, and all of you for coming. I know you're all excited about tax, why you're here. Well, some of you are, I know, but not everybody, and I get that. But hopefully after we talk for a while, you'll understand a little bit about why I'm passionate about tax and why I think it's so relevant to the kinds of issues that are central to the Barbara Jordan lecture series, because I think that is really important. So this morning, I can't say I had the most productive morning, a little bit nervous. I was reading the newspaper and I was really sad to learn that two children of South Sudanese immigrants were killed by a policeman near Syracuse a few weeks ago. Now there are questions about the circumstances of that happening, and you know, there are many important questions to ask about that and why that happened and what led that to happen. But to me, it also made me wonder why they were here, right? Why they weren't able to stay. So their parents fled violence in South Sudan. I understand that. But one of the questions that I ask is, what helped create the conditions that made South Sudan a place that that family needed to flee from and find themselves refuge here in the US? I'm glad they found refuge here. But it's really an important part of the story. So I'm telling a story that is, to me, very personal, and you'll get that throughout the talk. There's some very technical aspects to it, but we're not going to really focus on those today. I don't think this is the venue for that. And I think that's important because we're talking about a system that matters a great deal and is very impactful on millions, if not billions of lives. And it's important to understand that this is not just a technical subject, right? It's not just about, you know, a whole bunch of acronyms and, you know, numbers and algorithms and all that. At bottom, it's just about people. And it's about people, it's about finding ways to help people, generating the resources necessary to help people. That's why we're here. So, all right, so I'm gonna ask for some help to start. Does anybody know who this guy is? Does everybody know who this is? King Charles. All right, so the beginning of all this for me is my mom. So my mom is from Fargo, North Dakota, of all places. But she married a Bahamian guy and moved down to the Bahamas where he was from. And this is actually at the Bahamian Independence celebration. So my mom for years had told this story. And you know, when I was looking for pictures, I actually found, love the internet, so much on there. And the story she told was that she was at this party. She and my dad were at this party. And those of you, some of you have met my mom. She was here last. She came to my class, seminar last fall. It was great, and she had over the course of this party collected 4 of these helium balloons, one each for me and my 3 sisters. You can see them up on the roof there. And at some point, then Prince Charles came up to her and said, "What's with the balloons?" Oh, he didn't say it. I'm sure he said it in a very proper way. And she explained, you know, why she had these 4 balloons. She's going to take them home for 4 kids. I was, I think, less than 1 at this point, so I wasn't going to be playing with a balloon, but she wanted to make sure that all 4 of her kids got one of these balloons. They're quite nice, I guess. And, you know, when I think about this, I love this interaction for all sorts of reasons. But for me, it really symbolizes what was happening at this point in the life of the Bahamas and the other colonies. So for Prince Charles, this was all his stuff, right? the Bahamas was his, right? That everything was his. That's how it was. And my mom shows up and helps herself to 4 of these balloons, and he's like, "Come on, why are you taking my balloons? What's that for?" Um, but seriously, so I think that is true, and I'll explain why I think that's the story. When my mom came to the Bahamas, she was a nurse. She had trained as a nurse in the U.S. And came to the Bahamas, and I think had some licensing issues. Getting qualified in the Bahamas was different than. So she pursued a different career. She went back and got a master's in education and became a high school guidance counselor. And for years, she's long retired now, but for years, whenever I would walk around Nassau with her, somebody would say, "Oh, Mrs. Dean, how you doing?" And yes, she was a tiny little white lady in the Bahamas, which made her easy to spot, but she had been a guidance counselor to, I don't know, 20% of the adult population of Nassau for a while. So a lot of people did know her. But why did she become a teacher? She became a teacher or a guidance counselor, because there were a lot of opportunities for that. Why were there a lot of opportunities for that when she was there? So when my dad was growing up, the reason he ended up in North Dakota was that he had gone to a school run by Benedictine monks. So I went to a school run by Benedictine monks, and I always thought this was kind of a nice story. Great that these folks came down and started a school. But I didn't realize because there weren't really any public schools. So today there's a school called Government High School that still exists and is a good school. I didn't realize that it was the government high school because for a long time it was the only government high school. So the reason my dad went to a Benedictine run school is like in a monastery, really, really cool. But because there weren't public schools, because why would you bother educating these people? I mean, really. So there weren't schools. So dad ended up going to this Benedictine school. They arranged for him to go to college in Minnesota where their home order was. That's where he met mom, and they eventually moved back. But the reason, this is why independence was important, right? Independence is important for all sorts of reasons. But one reason it was important is because the colonial administrations did not like allowing colonies to spend money on frivolities like schools and hospitals, right? Not something that was a priority for them. And once you build them, you have to pay for them every year and staff them. Don't want to do that. So this was part of the story. And I imagine, Prince Charles was thinking about the balloons, but really he was thinking about, and all the others were thinking about all of the resources that these newly independent countries were going to start drawing from the global economy. And they weren't crazy about the idea. They were not super crazy about the idea. And so it's easy for me to think about, easier for me and maybe all of you to think about Prince Charles and his balloons, but understand that the story really is about key resources being deployed in ways that really were going to not just, give me a balloon. I was 11 months old. I wasn't going to play with a balloon, but things that were really going to help. Schools, hospitals, things that these countries really needed had been denied. So part of the story that I'm telling is one of greed and this kind of unwillingness to share that is, I guess, human, but not wonderful. But another part of the story I'm telling is one of courage and one of hope. So I don't know if anybody here can identify this guy. He's a little harder to identify than King Charles. That's fair. Does anybody know who this guy is? I'm offering clues. He was also, like Barbara Jordan, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus for a long time, a really influential member of the Congressional Black Caucus. So this handsome devil is Charles Rangel, representative from Harlem for many years. If you fast forward from the post-colonial era to 2000, the world had sort of looked around and said, it seems strange that we're really not able to tax these multinationals. Why can't we do it? And they turned to an organization that had been basically in charge of global tax policy. In charge is a little strong, but they were a leading voice in international tax policy. And they said, well, OECD, why can't we tax these multinationals? And they thought about it for a while, and they came back with a list. They came back with, they didn't call it a blacklist, but everybody else called it a blacklist. They came up with a list of countries that they said were ruining it for all of us. They were the reason that we couldn't tax multinationals. They were tax havens. And on this list, incredibly, were emissions that were quite jarring. Switzerland was not on the list. None of the OECD members could be technically, according to the way they did it, a tax haven. So even though Switzerland was certainly, and Luxembourg and the rest were important now, were acknowledged as tax havens. On this list, they were not there. At the same time, other countries were, like Liberia. And I am not an expert in African affairs, but I had happened to, when I was in practice, have an asylum client from Liberia. So I had spent hours talking to this guy about what he was fleeing from in Liberia, and the idea that not only were Europeans and Americans hiding ill-gotten gains in Liberia, but that sanctioning Charles Taylor's regime would persuade him to stop. All of this is crazy. It's just absolutely nuts. And where Charles Rangel comes into it, so the OECD had been pressing for sanctions on these countries. So Liberia was about to be sanctioned by OECD member countries for its supposed role as a tax haven. And two things happened. And I actually have to credit one of my RAs for helping me understand how this happened. I knew that Charles Rangel and a bunch of other members, about a little more than half the Congressional Black Caucus, had sent a letter to the Treasury Secretary, Paul O'Neill, urging him to not allow sanctions to be imposed on these countries. But what I didn't know, and what my RA found for me, was another letter by a non-voting delegate from the US Virgin Islands. So this non-voting delegate from the US Virgin Islands, Delegate Christensen, had written a similar letter a few days before, and then had persuaded a lot of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus to join, including Representative Rangel, who was the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee for a long time, a knowledgeable tax expert. And it was because, along with Liberia, the US Virgin Islands were included in this list of tax havens and were going to be sanctioned. And I think that the OECD not only didn't realize that Liberia, I honestly think they didn't know anything about Liberia, just included on their list to be sanctioned for not great reasons. But they didn't realize, it didn't occur to them perhaps, that this representative, this delegate, non-voting delegate, had a bunch of powerful friends like this guy. So this story is one that had never really been told until I started writing about it a few years ago. I remember reading about it when it happened. And the way it was described in the leading history of this era was that the Congressional Black Caucus were duped into fighting against this effort against tax havens. They just didn't know what was going on, and they didn't really understand it. So that's there's no reason to believe that that's true, and well, there's no good reason to think that that's true. But what Charles Rangel did a few years later, I think, really underscores what was really important. So a few years after this, actually 10 years after this, Charles Rangel was the chair of House Ways and Means, and he created a new way, not of targeting tax havens, but of targeting tax evaders. So what FATCA is what it's called. Yes, I know they could have added a T and made it FATCAT, but they didn't. I don't know why. FATCA targeted foreign banks rather than countries and said, you will tell us about Americans who are banking with you, banks all over the world, including in Switzerland. You're going to tell us when you have an American there, and there are many problems with FATCA. It is not free of problems in lots of respects. But rather than targeting specific countries like Liberia or the US Virgin Islands, it targeted banks all over the world and made them provide information. So it does not seem quite right to me that Charles Rangel and these really other sophisticated members of Congress were duped into supporting this effort. I think they looked at something that struck them as basically a cross-border racial profiling and said, I'm not sure that it's right to sanction Liberia but not Switzerland for this problem to the extent we think it's a problem. So anyway, so that's sort of, I think, the best and worst of the story I'm telling, just to give you some context. All right. So the story I'm telling about the global tax system is not the one, so I'm also teaching international tax, the overview class this semester, and I haven't taught it for a while. It's great to get in and see what the textbook says about all this. And the textbook essentially says this. So the textbook tells us the reason we have the system of international taxation today we know the answer. And, you can imagine the voice, the sort of voiceover voice that's telling you this. The reason we have the system of international taxation, which is dominated by a network of treaties that were based on a League of Nations model from the 20s, is quite simple, right? It's for the sole purpose, and this is taken from an actual scholarly article, not very old, just saying this, I'm not making this up, for the sole purpose of mitigating international double taxation so that governments could benefit from international economic liberalization. There are many, many problems with that, including the fact that how could we possibly know that that's the sole purpose? that's an insane claim to make, but one that is accepted wholeheartedly in tax circles. So the book is really a question, and it's why do we really have the system, and what does it mean for us? Okay, so as part of the exploration, I can remember the article I was reading when I had this realization. It's by two authors, Marion and Ash. They were trying to figure out how the dispersion of terms throughout treaties had worked over time. And this wasn't part of their article at all, but they had one chart that showed the proliferation of treaties. And that chart showed that there were approximately 0, I'm rounding down from maybe 15, treaties until the early 60s, and then they really proliferated. And this was not the story that I was told. I was told the League of Nations created these treaties. The OECD took over at some point, but this is really sort of a continuous thing from the 20s until now. Certainly not true looking at this. So I've been puzzling for a long time about what could have happened around this time that could have prompted this real change in the attitude towards these treaties. And sometimes a coincidence is just a coincidence, but I like this one. On the same day in 1960, the OECD Charter was signed, and also the General Assembly of the UN had its declaration on the granting of independence to the colonial countries and peoples. So, again, I'm picturing, so the Bahamas became independent much later than most of the African countries. A lot of the Caribbean countries became independent in the 70s, in the 50s and 60s for most of Africa. But I'm imagining Prince Charles lamenting those balloons, and I know that a lot of what was happening globally were fears about what would happen with Africa's decolonization. And there are a lot of great histories that have come out over the past few years looking at both the colonial taxation, the history of taxation in the colonial era in Africa, and also what's happening during decolonization. And it's really fascinating. The histories detailing the fears that a lot of business people had and policymakers had about just the chaos that was going to unfold when African colonies became independent, just because they didn't think that Africans had the skills to be able to deal with this. They really were quite nervous. And so the OECD was created. And the OECD was created as an alternative to organizations like the UN that were about to become a lot more diverse. So the OECD at the time that it was founded, it was created by taking the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, basically a Marshall Plan entity. We took that, we added in Canada and the US, and that became the OECD. And this organization became sort of the central repository for global tax policy over the next few decades. At the time, and I remember talking about this with somebody from Europe, they don't understand how we talk about race in the US. So when I said that this was an all-white organization, they said, but Turkey. And I said, well, if you look at the Census Bureau's definition of what white is, which is in our heads, they're white, and that's crazy. I was like, yes, it's crazy, but so is racism. So I'm not the one making it up. I'm just telling you what's happening. So the story of the OECD today, certainly, and it is true, the story today is one of expertise. The reason that they are acknowledged as sort of the source of international tax knowledge is that they are the ones who have all the expertise. But at the time, so this was even before the OECD was formed, the UN was thinking about loaning them some experts so they could really get a handle on this whole international tax thing. So the OECD was created, tasked with this job, and its chief qualification was not expertise, which is its chief qualification today, but at the time it seems to be that it wasn't the UN. And just to capture, I think certainly hard for tax people to think about the system that they know and love. I mean, I love it too. Certainly loved it. Now I have more complicated feelings towards it. Understanding how the experts that we all really respect, you guys all know this guy's name, I'm sure even those who are not big fans of economics, so how they felt about the UN and the feelings they had about this organization are not ones that I think you will like. He, at some point, sent a cable to the British Treasury after attending a conference. It was a UN conference about the creation of the World Bank and the IMF, and he called it the most monstrous monkey house assembled for years. So you can see why they might have preferred another place to do the serious business of shaping global tax policy. This was just the world that existed. This is how things looked at the time. So fast forward to today. So as I said, I'm from the Bahamas, so this makes me happy, or it should. It doesn't actually, and you'll know why. But today, so much of the trajectory of global tax policy has been shaped by what happened so many years ago, and I'm just going to move to today. So this is what international tax policy looks like today. I don't know if anybody of you heard the recent talk about the global minimum tax. Some of you may have heard about that or not. It's one of the biggest things to happen in global tax policy in many years. This is another effort to combat the challenges that were raised in around 2000, trying to figure out why we can't tax multinationals, trying to figure it out. And this palm tree figures into this in a surprising way, to me, surprising, maybe to you as well. So if you look at a brochure that the OECD published in 2021. This was when they were proposing this, they called the two pillars. So this is one of the two pillars that's about creating a global minimum tax of 15%. Some of you this may sound vaguely familiar to some of you. And the key is that they really can't explain why they need it, or what it's for, or what the policy rationale for it is, but they don't have to, because of course a picture is worth 1,000 words. In their brochure that they published, they included this diagram explaining what the global minimum tax was, and this is an explanation for the global minimum tax is inadequate in a million different respects, but one of the most important is that they realized they couldn't say tax haven anymore, but they really had to find a way to convey the sense of what they are really trying to convey. So they used that palm tree and they added another one. So what this does in a way that the OECD's 2000 blacklist didn't do, the low tax jurisdictions they're talking about, that they're thinking about, the experts describe, the big seven havens, only two of them arguably look like that. And Bermuda, I'm not sure, really does look like that. I think they want to look like that, but I'm not sure. I'm from the Bahamas, I can say that about them. But the low tax jurisdictions we're mostly talking about are, again, Switzerland, Ireland, Luxembourg. I haven't been there lately, but I still don't think that's what they look like, right? I'm pretty sure. And what they're trying to do is they're explaining to the world that the reason we need the OECD and the reason we need their global minimum tax is because of countries like this, right? And I assure you that most of the people who looked at the brochure did not say, oh, of course, they're using that sun-drenched coconut tree-laden island, but we, of course, know they mean Switzerland, right? That is not what happened in anybody's head except mine. So I saw this and just describe it politely, popped a gasket. I wrote about this in a few different fora, and I was very surprised to find that. So I wrote an article where I described this and explained why it was problematic. And I was describing that episode, and I was going to check the link to see make sure the brochure was still alive. And I realized they actually edited it. And so after I had written the first article, they edited it and replaced it with this. Which is not bad, but what they hadn't counted on, which I am so delighted for, I'm so grateful to the student editors of the Utah Law Review, where the first article was published, they archived the link. So if you search the brochure, you'll get this version. But if you look in the footnotes of that article from the Utah Law Review, you'll get the perma link, and it shows you can see the difference. So you can see the palm tree laden island, or this one. And really, why would you even publish this image? It doesn't say anything, right? You can see why they needed that one, but this doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't. There's no information here, which is really, I think, the point. So why does this matter? And I think the reason that it matters, there's a South African scholar who I really respect, Afton Titus, who, in writing about the global minimum tax, described, I think accurately, she's smarter than me, so why would I doubt her, that what the global minimum tax does is actually transfer revenues from countries like Rwanda to countries like the United States. Right? So Rwanda, she described, she's an expert in African tax policy. She described their corporate tax and explained how it was carefully designed to provide incentives for things that Rwanda's been told for years are appropriate things to do, but now with the global minimum tax are considered inappropriate. And so what the global minimum tax does is it looks to see whether other countries are taxing at a minimum 15%, and if it's not, any other country can take it. I don't know if that seems familiar. I'm thinking a little bit of Johnson v. McIntosh for those of you who are first-year law students. Oh, you're not using that? I'll take it. Thanks. That's great. I love that. That's wonderful. Thanks so much. But that's what Afton Titus describes, and it's obviously more complicated than that, but it's also not. This is a system that is being justified with these silly images, dangerous images, I think, and that are really damaging, right? So I think that if the histories I've been describing talk about the impact of the inability of these jurisdictions, once they became independent, to tax, the cascading impacts that had on their inability to keep their promises to build schools and hospitals, and what that did to countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the impact it had on their democracies. This is important stuff, and incredibly, it's still happening. It's still happening that tax policies are being shaped by organizations that are, undemocratic in the sense that there has still never been a majority black member of the OECD all these years later. It's not all white anymore. Costa Rica is a relatively new member, which is wonderful. Japan has been a member for decades, but it's still not a representative organization, and it is still the one that is publishing and revising brochures like this, trying to tell us what our global tax policy should look like. So for me, the book is really trying to tell the story, why it's important, why it's important that we think about the role that race plays in this context where, trust me, nobody's ever talked about race before, but it's important to ask about these things and to think about how they affect global tax policy moving forward. The biggest flashpoint these days is whether the UN should take over global tax policy. And of course, the recent histories have shown that the UN would be retaking over global tax policy. That was not known for a long time. It was assumed that the League of Nations did its work and then the OECD just sort of took over, not that it actually displaced an active UN global tax policy making body. So I'm not sure where I stand on that. I'm not sure that the UN is a place where global tax policy would get the best possible results. But I do think that an undemocratic global tax policy making body like the OECD is flawed. It's flawed, it's imperfect, and we at least need to think hard about what a better approach might be. So I could talk all day about this, but I should not. So I will stop and we'll take questions from in the room. And if there are any online, we'll do that too. And I've already had some feedback from colleagues and others, so I'll try to respond to that as I respond. So thanks so much. Please, Gary.
Yeah, I have a tradition of pleading ignorance to pretty much any topic that's talked about. This is ignorant beyond ignorant.
I hear you, but I don't believe you either.
Going back to the 1950s, 1960s.
Yeah.
Question is, what was the expected ideological composition of the former colonial countries? Put bluntly, how much of this was driven by concerns about global communism as opposed to overt racial concerns?
So it's a very interesting question, and so I've referred to it a couple times, but I'll just describe it now specifically. So there's an historian out of Sydney, Nikki Teo, who just wrote the history of sort of the UN global tax policy making body in the 1950s. It's incredible stuff. It's really quite explosive in this field because nobody really has studied. We've been told for years that nothing happened, that the UN didn't do anything. And one of the most fascinating episodes she talks about is about the what was called the old Cuban taxation gambit, and I'll explain what that means. So at the time, just before the UN was displaced, there were more and more countries in the global south taking their place in the UN, and there was a time when the UN global tax body was considering how to tackle these issues, and the group that was tasked with this job at one juncture was majority global south, which made folks quite nervous. And what was really fascinating, she's a great historian, so she actually found the records of the State Department's efforts to sort of pregame for this. And what she found was that the State Department was very nervous about the fact that there was a majority of global South countries on this in this decision-making body, plus Cuba, plus the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, so they were worried about what would happen, and they were worried about how this would play out. And it turns out that, as they feared, Cuba did its thing, suggested what they had called the old Cuban taxation gambit, which was about granting more tax priority, more tax sovereignty to source countries. So in the way we think about the world from a tax point of view, there are source countries and residence countries. There are countries where income is generated and countries where that income then goes home to its owner. And relatively poor countries are disproportionately source countries. They import capital. So the old Cuban taxation gambit was an effort to prioritize source countries. And so if you don't want to call it the old Cuban taxation gambit, you can call it what Cuba called it, which I think I'm picturing in the book is about 3 or 4 lines of text, which we're not going to do. We're not going to do that. And the U.S. was worried that this body would favor this, and that would become the way global tax policy would look. It didn't turn out that way. It turns out that the Soviet Union just thought this was all some sort of capitalist enterprise and wanted no part of even the old Cuban taxation gambit. So what to the extent the UN was thought about at all because of its role in global tax policy, the explanation for why it had never had a role was that was the sort of early Cold War tensions between the U.S. and the USSR, But it turns out the story was much more complicated than that. So those, and to me, and this is my naive view, is that it would seem, if we're trying to fight a Cold War and we're trying to win over allies in the global South, this would not be the way to do it. Stripping them of their tax sovereignty, moving global tax policy from the UN to the OECD, to me, would not be the way to win hearts and minds. But maybe they made a calculation that tax is so boring that nobody would notice or care. That may have been what they thought. So it certainly is possible. But again, the wonderful work done by folks like Nikki Teo show that the Cold War dimension here was only a part of it, and it was much more complicated in practice than it might seem like it should be. You guys are being so shy, it's adorable.
Can I give this a shot? Yes. Okay, it's working. Again, no knowledge of the OECD, like my colleague here, but I do have some inklings about another sort of end of things, development finance, through a connection, and I know that other things, parts of the World Bank that I'm a little bit familiar with, have had in the 65 years since the founding of the OECD, a much more concern about the environmental impact of individual programs and the displacement of indigenous communities by individual programs. And now they must be having a lot of thinking about global climate impacts worldwide. So I'm wondering whether any of that would get into the tax thinking of the OECD today, that while founded 65 years ago for very sinister, global reasons, that they find themselves now, even the multinationals who are trying to avoid taxation now are busily greening themselves and trying to present a posture of caring about issues of the environment, of the climate particularly, but also about displacement of people that might interfere with the original plan and might have some hope for maybe introducing. I know the World Bank has a lot of representation from global developing countries in its organization, although the people who own it and appoint the leaders of it are the big rich industrialized countries. So I just wondered about that aspect of things moving forward all these decades and all these new issues coming up, perhaps.
No, very interesting question, and it is certainly true that there are a whole range of international economic law bodies that are weighing out of these kinds of issues. So the kinds that John Maynard Keynes was so worried about, included these organizations because they would have universal membership, right? So the IMF, the World Bank, even though, as you say, the shareholding numbers are such that even though you're a member, you don't necessarily have a big voice, but you are members, and that was unacceptable. So there are, and it's, when I say that the OECD is in charge of global tax policymaking, that is an overstatement. There are a lot of other organizations that play a role. The IMF and the World Bank certainly have a role in tax. And what's fascinating about the way that the shift from sort of disproportionate voting power to total absence of representation, what that does proves to be significant. So as you're suggesting, even having a voice in this process for that entire time has been impactful for the Global South. What's happening these days in climate taxation, so you guys have all heard of carbon tax. There is sort of a cross-border way of doing this. So it's called a border adjustment. God, you're all going to go to sleep for sure now. So the way this works is if you, country, have a carbon tax, you don't want to import goods from another country that doesn't have them without making some sort of adjustment. Because if you do that, all your businesses are going to get outcompeted by that country that does not have a carbon tax. It's not going to work. So what the OECD has proposed is a border adjustment that basically allows countries with carbon taxes to collect, which is maybe fine, and then keep, which I would say is not so fine, those border adjustments. So if you're, say, hypothetically, a wealthy European country with a carbon tax, and you're importing something from a developing country that is busy with other things and not imposing a carbon tax, what that approach would allow the wealthy country to do is basically collect the carbon tax for that developing country and then keep it. And I object to only the last step. And I think that last step is one that might not have been proposed in a world where the global tax rules were designed in a more representative body. You might have changed that last step where the rich country keeps the proceeds of the carbon tax. So there are ways you can do this, and this is actually happening, and that is a good thing. I say I'm from the Bahamas. The highest point in the whole country is 206 feet above sea level on an island I've never been to. It's not a good thing. So I'm in favor of carbon taxes. I wish they were a little less regressive in the way they're being designed. The idea that a rich country is going to keep those proceeds is a little heartbreaking, but I think is, again, part of the story I'm telling, that there are ways to do this. And when you look at the history of the system, I think that it is certainly true that there were many good reasons to have the OECD take over global tax policy. And it is certainly true that a lot of people have worked very hard at the OECD in good faith for many years to do the best job they possibly can. I certainly believe that. But I think it's important to understand what the costs are. And I think the border adjustment mechanism that's being proposed is yet another example of the kind of costs you have of relying on this non-representative expert body to make these kinds of global decisions. A few more hands.
Thank you so much. Let me get to, are there any student questions?
You talked about the certain nations basically taking away autonomy of other nations regarding the global tax, but I was curious if you could talk about the flip side of it, in that corporations are likely not good faith actors and are seeking out potentially ever lower tax rates for their own benefit, and they don't seem to be as interested in the welfare of the states that they end up at, as opposed to the flip side of it.
Sure. So incredibly, I haven't told you the whole history. I spared you the very early history of the system, but my international tax students are going to get it soon enough. So what happened incredibly at the end of World War I, right before the end of World War I, there was a new kind of tax credit. I know, I'm sorry guys. It's called the foreign tax credit. And this was proposed by a tax nerd many years ago. And it was embraced by Congress right before the end of World War I. And what it basically did was it said that for every dollar of foreign tax you pay, the US is going to treat that as paid to the US Treasury, which is just as crazy as it sounds, right? Can you imagine? You owe me $5 and you say, oh, I paid that other guy. You're like, that's cool. Yeah, that totally works for me. So this was how it worked. And you may ask yourself what the US was doing. It's really not that hard to explain. At the end of World War I, Europe needed help. And the US could provide it, but it was definitely not interested in being directly involved in the way that it was after World War II. It wanted private actors to do the rebuilding, and it was very happy to write checks in the way of tax breaks in this way to encourage private actors to do this. And so it did. And this, there are all these old rivalries that you get to read about in the papers of these guys. So T.S. Adams was the guy who proposed it. And you can read in his writing that he was like, I couldn't believe Congress did it. It was so wonderful. And one of his rivals, this was scathing, I think, for the 20s, called it a present of revenues to other treasuries. I think that was pretty harsh at the time. So this was controversial. But one of the great parts about it, well, two great parts about it. it actually favors poor countries. Yes, these were European poor countries, easier perhaps to favor, but it favors poor countries, source countries. And the other part is it ensures that tax is collected everywhere. So there's another history. After this system the U.S. created, it was unilateral. We just created this foreign tax credit, which is just a gift of revenues to other countries. Multinationals hated it, and had been pushing through the International Chamber of Commerce. They've been pushing for the kinds of rules that we ended up getting from the League of Nations at the end of the 20s, so about a decade after the U.S. foreign tax credit. They were embodied in the League of Nations draft treaties that were created, lacked the mechanism to make sure tax was collected somewhere. So the two great things about the foreign tax credit were it favors poor countries and it makes sure that the way you get out of the US tax is by showing that you paid tax somewhere else. So there's always one tax being paid. So that was one, there's the two benefits. And so starting in the 20s, multinationals are desperate for treaties. They really are fighting for them. There's a great story that Madeleine Wilker tells about France and the great lengths the US went to get a treaty with France and the impact it would have on US multinationals like Citibank operating in France, the amount of money it would save them. So the story isn't, why was greed invented in the 1960s, right? There was plenty of it back in the 20s and 30s and 40s. The question is how we got a global tax policymaking body that was so undemocratic and so secretive that we ended up getting rules that nobody liked. So remember, the story in 2000 was, why can't we tax multinationals, right? And the answer was this list of countries, including Liberia, which is ridiculous. But the question was a good one. But the answer was wrong. The answer was that a system of rules that we adopted starting in the 1960s were almost designed to prevent countries from collecting tax. But the reason we got them was, and I love thinking about this, do I love it? I think it's very compelling. So Hedda McGee in her book, The Sum of Us, talks about when pools were integrated in the US. And they just went away, right? They're like, well, we could integrate the pools or we just fill them in with dirt and not have them, right? Then we're going to go with the dirt option, right? We're going to fill our pools in with dirt. And to me, this is the story of global tax policy, right? In the teens, the U.S. said, here, just throw money at Europe. That'll be great. Just take as much as you want. It'll be awesome. In the 20s and 30s and 40s, U.S. multinationals fought for a system that would be more favorable to the U.S. In terms of where the revenues went, but also be more favorable to them in terms of less tax. But they didn't get it until they were able to scare the world with the prospect of, not balloons being collected by my mom, but hospitals and schools being built in these newly independent countries. And that was the moment where all of a sudden, not collecting tax seemed like a great idea. And unfortunately, we've been stuck in that place with our pools all filled in with dirt ever since.
Thanks, Stephen. As you know, the current head of global tax policy for the OECD is a graduate of this law school. She just took it over in this summer, so she can't be blamed for anything that happened in 1960.
Yet.
Which I think was actually before she was born. She was my student 32 years, my research assistant 32 years ago, I think. But anyway, so I don't know if anything in the OECD is going to change, but I'm wondering, for the uninitiated among us, I'm not going to plead as much ignorance as Lawson has, because Lawson is always better at me than everything, including ignorance. But I'm wondering, what is it that would be a good change? Like because I understand this notion that multinational corporations get away with not paying tax. But and then any attempt to adjust that will have, positive effects for some countries and negative effects for others. So what is it that we should look for? What is it that we should push for the OECD or some other body to do about this problem of not being able to pay collect tax? Who ought to be collecting the tax? Who ought to be paying it, and who ought to not be collecting it? I guess is my
Yeah.
question.
So I think it's a great question, and it's certainly true that I try to remain optimistic because there are positive changes. So in 2015, there was a big push to get everything shifted to the UN, and the OECD successfully resisted that. The US also resisted that. We really didn't want that to happen, and what happened after that was that the OECD created what it calls its inclusive framework. So if it says it's inclusive, it must be, right? So what this is a way for non-members to approve, and they're really given a choice of approving or not approving the policies that the OECD is proposing, including these pillars. So the OECD on its website says that over 90% of the world's GDP approves of, I guess, either one of these, both, which should make you nervous for all sorts of reasons. It's the OECD opining on the approval of its own proposal, and as you say, anything that's in the space should be at least a little bit controversial. But if it's got a 90% approval rating, you wonder whether the numbers are really that accurate. So I think there are improvements, but one of the other backstories here that's to me so interesting is the long history and the role that U.S. Reconstruction, post-Civil War Reconstruction, played in sort of poisoning the well here. So the story that was told about U.S. Reconstruction up until mid 20th century was that what made it go badly was giving blacks the right to vote. They were bad at it. So that was one of the reasons that the world seemed okay, or the U.S. seemed okay with Jim Crow and preventing blacks from voting. The story that was in textbooks used in the U.S. in the mid 20th century, sort of the Dunning School of historians talking about the role that blacks played in the collapse of Reconstruction. This, historians have shown, really affected the way the world saw non-white governance, right? So this story of how you protect the world from the threat of non-white governance and the rise of the OECD as part of that. I think that one of the important lessons we could draw from Reconstruction is fixing those kinds of structural systems designed to disenfranchise people is very hard, right? The 14th Amendment didn't quite do it. The 15th Amendment kind of did it, but didn't really. And we ended up, again, having Barbara Jordan elected the first black woman from the South in Congress. She graduated here in '59. I'm not sure when she was elected, but it was a long time after the end of the Civil War. So it's very hard to fix these things. And I think that even though we see some positive signs, the inclusive framework is not a bad thing. I think that having somebody like the really talented Manal Corwin as the head of OECD's tax policy shop is not a bad thing. But the question is, another green shoot, the African Union was made a permanent member of the G20, which is sort of the supervising body to a lot of this OECD tax work. That was after the African Union made a push in the General Assembly to have things move to the UN. So these are all positive developments. But the question for me is, and the story of Reconstruction makes me very nervous, very pessimistic, what would be enough? What would be enough to make sure that global tax policy reflected the desires of Rwanda? I'm not really quite sure. And I'm not really quite sure what that would look like. One example of something that else is going on at the same time, and that really was behind a lot of what was happening with this global minimum tax, in about 5 or 6 years ago, France designed a new kind of tax called the digital services tax. You guys could easily figure out what France was up to with that. It was mad about Amazon and Google and Apple, all these US companies not paying any tax. So the digital services tax they designed was basically to tax those digital giants. And the US was not happy about that at all. The US Trade Representative has threatened, I don't know whether to impose, but threatened sanctions on France and every other country that has proposed digital services tax. And one of the things you have to agree to if you agree to the OECD's 2 pillars is not to collect a digital services tax. That's part of this plan, which again, to me, there's no reason why it would be part of this plan other than because the US really wants and is really mad about these digital service taxes. So just this summer, I was talking about this project in Nairobi, and I was talking with some of the folks who were working in the tax space there, and they were telling me that Kenya, which is one of the countries that had resisted this plan, one of a handful of countries that resisted the enormous pressure that the OECD and the US had put on other countries to agree to it, was maybe going to get on board and give up the millions of dollars they've been collecting through its digital service tax in response to that pressure. So there are taxes like that that could actually help a little bit, but even those are being displaced or repressed by this structure. So there's some good and there's some not so good, but there is definitely some reason for optimism, but a lot of reason for worry as well.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I think this is sort of a follow-up to Jack's question. It seemed like your answer focused a lot on process, which makes sense. What would an inclusive, deliberative process for devising global tax policy look like? And I think underlying his question and mine, I'm sort of struggling over this, is if we had such a process, what substantive rules might emerge that would address the concerns that you're thinking about and talking about? And so we get back to that question in the knots of like, okay, so how can we make corporations, multinationals actually, pay taxes? So what would the rules look like in your ideal world?
So in my ideal world, first of all, we would not be we'd be creating. We would not be banning digital services taxes. We would be trying to make sure that countries that have, for lots of reasons, a hard time imposing taxes on global giants like Apple and Google, they would find it easier to collect these digital service taxes. We'd be promoting those as a way for countries that really don't have another way to tax these global giants to be able to use this. So we wouldn't be combating it, we'd be allowing it or encouraging it. So, but this story goes all the way back, and I'll use another historical example for an example of a tax policy that the US disfavored that would have benefited the Global South. So I talked about the foreign tax credit. In the early 60s, there was a thing, there still is, but it was disfavored by the US, something called tax sparing. And it doesn't actually result in tax revenues be collected by source country. But what it would do, it would preserve the benefit of the tax holiday that a developing country was granting, that Rwanda would grant. So the opposite of what the global minimum tax says. So the global minimum tax says, thank you for granting that tax holiday, even for very good reasons, valid reasons to this company. We're going to take that money. We're going to collect that. So what the tax sparing provision would have done would be to, at least in certain circumstances, would be allow that country, if they had done their homework right and gotten the tax incentives right, to deploy those tax incentives to be able to grow and no longer need them. The US decided that tax sparing was not for it. And there's we can say nasty things about people from Harvard, right? Okay. So there's a really famous tax scholar, was John F. Kennedy's chief tax advisor, and he hated tax sparing. He hated a lot of things, but tax sparing he hated a lot. And he successfully got it kicked out of the US-Pakistan treaty, which brought him to the attention of then Senator Kennedy, and is part of the reason he became his chief tax policy advisor. So there are specific choices that have been made over time that were made because of a skepticism over poor countries and their ability to engage in the kind of tax policy that we do all the time. And I think that the nervousness that the US has over digital service taxes is I think that's the clearest example of something that today could help. I'm not, even experts today are divided over whether tax sparing would be a good thing, but I find it difficult to articulate a clear reason for why Kenya should not be able to collect tens of millions of dollars in digital service taxes from global giants. That I don't understand at all.
Yeah, thank you. That's super helpful. Just as a follow-up, what if we didn't focus on Kenya, but focused on Switzerland and Ireland and countries that don't necessarily sort of need these incentives in order to get economic development, but maybe you're more sympathetic to the idea that they may be serving as havens for multinationals to attract taxes. So, is there a way to address that? Are we done?
The room likes your question. No, I think the room likes your question a lot. Thanks, Stacey. So, and this is, I think, one of the dynamics that I think is really important. So, Gabriel Zuckman has been a really fierce and vocal critic of tax havens. And he's done a lot of writing on this, and I've engaged with him a little bit about this. And so he, in his book, suggested just imposing sanctions on Switzerland. And he says, let's just impose sanctions on Switzerland. Let's just do that. And I'd be much more in favor of that than imposing sanctions on Liberia. And I think we could do that, right? So over the course of the pandemic, when this was unfolding, it was a coincidence it all happened during the pandemic. The way that the global minimum tax rate of 15% was set was that Ireland's rate was 12.5%, and it really didn't want it to be much higher than that. The African states wanted something more like 30 or 40%, but we listened much more to Ireland than to African states. So I think that there's still, to me, a sense that we could be much tougher with the countries that we have a lot of ways to be tough with, but we choose not to. And we end up with policies like this that are designed to curry favor with Ireland with a 15% rate, much lower than a lot of other countries, poor countries wanted. And taking money away from Rwanda, which is not necessarily a good thing we want to do, because if we actually, another time I got a little grumpy when Biden announced his one of his plans, the Made in America tax plan. In his speech, he named 2 of the big 7 havens, and you won't be surprised which ones he named in his speech. It was Bermuda and the Cayman Islands. And I wrote an open letter to him in the Nation saying that I didn't like that very much. And I also knew a bunch of the folks who were working for Yellen and Biden in their tax policy organization. And I know at least one of them said, please don't do that again. And so in his, he soon after that talked to the joint session of Congress, and he included Switzerland as well in that litany. And I was obviously entertained by that, but I was also entertained by the blowback. That did not go over well. Switzerland did not appreciate that. And I talked a little bit about, so I didn't mention his name. So Surrey was the Harvard guy. Is it Harvard that way? Surrey was, yeah, that way. So Surrey was the expert for the Kennedy administration. In a related article, I tell the story of the original global minimum tax called Subpart F. Tax nerds, anybody know Subpart F? Nobody knows what that is. But they designed it, and actually one of the first things I did here, I remember I ran into Jonathan Feingold when I was headed over to the Rare Book Library at Harvard to do the research for this. You can look through Surrey's papers over there, and I was fascinated to learn that Subpart F was clearly designed with Switzerland in mind. They were actually, they were getting so much pushback from Switzerland that there was some talk of criminal prosecutions by Switzerland for corporate espionage for our people doing research into US subsidiaries, Swiss subsidiaries of US companies. So it's hard for us to attack Switzerland in this way. It's much easier for us to pretend to the public that we're just going after these countries with nice beaches, because everybody's in favor of that. Even if the result, and so one thing the minimum tax would do that I have no problem with is taking money from Switzerland rather than from Rwanda. So please take that money, but leave Rwanda their money. That's sort of where I draw the line. So there are definitely ways to do it, but understanding the role that race plays in allowing us to do the things we want to do, yes, I think the US should have nice roads and technology and all the infrastructure that Biden was talking about, but if you have to name Bermuda and the Cayman Islands in order to do it, and you have to take money from Rwanda in order to do it, rather than just going after Switzerland, that's where I have a problem.
Thank you so much. So we're about to wrap up, but I want to give you the opportunity to address our amazing students here, some who are very committed to issues of racial justice, working domestically, who are thinking about public interest, government, law firms, and so forth. Why is it important to study tax? Why is it important to study tax in law school?
Well, I would say, thank you very much. And I would say not just tax, but all of those subjects that you think maybe are not for you. And, one of the benefits of growing up in the Bahamas is that, I didn't grow up in a culture that made it clear that I could do some things and I shouldn't do others. So in a lot of ways, it was really dumb of me to go into tax, an area that is disproportionately white, and is really hostile to a lot of the ideas that I really am interested in. But I didn't know any better because I was from the Bahamas. It was great. But the advantage of that, naivete on my part is that there are really obvious things that I can say, like, please don't put palm trees in your brochure when you mean Switzerland. I know what you're doing, and it's not okay. So that's not hard, but nobody else was doing it. So it's not that I had to be the world's greatest tax expert to say, like, please don't put palm trees in your brochure when you don't mean that, because it's racist, okay? Don't do it. So there are a lot of really impactful things you can do that are just not gonna be that. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit, is what I'm saying. So don't be intimidated if people tell you it's not for you, or they're sending signals. Like the thing people say about taxes, it's really for smart people, which again, I didn't realize a lot of Black people would hear and be like, oh, I'm not gonna spend the next 30 years persuading people that I'm smart enough to do this. I'm gonna go do something else. I was like, yeah, I'm smart. Yeah, I'll do that. That sounds great. So I think that don't be intimidated by things that people are suggesting you think are not for you, because they sure as hell are. And there are really important things you can do, in part because maybe other people aren't gonna be as crazy as you are to do it. So go ahead and be a little crazy. Do those things that maybe are not really for you, because they are. They're for you. They're for everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.